Happy Saturday, Risers. Saagar and I are back to take another look at some of our favorite segments from the week. We had a bunch of interesting conversations, of course. Nomiki Konst discussed the controversy surrounding the DNC's convention nominations. Former CDC Director Dr. Tom Frieden broke down the latest news surrounding the coronavirus epidemic. And friend of the show, Torre, joined us to discuss Kobe Bryant's legacy in the wake of the tragic death of one of the NBA's all-time greats.
But many of our guests this week focused on the rise of populism and progressive politics in the Midwest, with the Iowa caucuses just days away. Bernie Sanders, he holds a slim lead over Joe Biden in the polls, and this week we had no shortage of interviews that can explain why. To begin with, I want to go back to our conversation with the author Michael Lind. He highlighted how China's rise as an industrial power in the 90s and the early 2000s, it set the course for a populist-leaning political climate that we have today. Let's take a listen.
If you look at the rise of populism in the US and the UK, Western Europe, it's concentrated in former industrial areas that were struck heavily by Chinese import competition in the 2000s, where most of the voters used to vote for social democrats or even communists in some cases in Europe, and for liberal Democrats in the United States. So I think you have to distinguish this Nixon era realignment of the old segregationist Dixiecrats into the Republicans and this new phenomenon. It really is new and different, and it's related to deindustrialization.
Saagar, he was fascinating to talk to.
Yeah, he's a I've been a friend for a while, and I've followed his work very closely. He's not really right or left. He's just he's been on both. What he talks about, which I love, is we talk about it here, which is when people are like, "Oh, Trump is it's just racism." That's all it is. What he points out in his book is that communities that were most impacted by Chinese bad trade policy with China disproportionately back Trump and Bernie Sanders in every single case throughout the Democratic primary. Even today, that's the case. One of the things I love that you pointed out is that in Steve King's district in Iowa is the #1 district for Bernie Sanders.
Right.
How is it that that's possible? It's because both of the phenomenon of right and left-wing populism is boosted totally by the fact that elites have sold you out on so many different levels. And I think that's what Michael so perfectly points out, is that this election and the last election is a reckoning with decades and decades of policy that has finally come to fruition.
Yeah, I'd love to see him in a discussion or debate with Thomas Frank, who, what's the matter with Kansas, and talks about that populist progressive tradition in the heartland that has just really changed over time. But I think we're back now to this point where populism is on the rise. It's something I'd like to dig into more. If Bernie Sanders is able to win Iowa, I'd love to dig into those undercurrents
and the rural
and the history of it, and the rural. What does the rural connect there? Because I think that's a very rich vein to mine. Meanwhile, we also had friend of the show Matt Karp of Jacobin on this week. He explained how Bernie's appeal in Vermont could translate to voters in the more rural areas of the Midwest.
A lot of these places in Vermont bear resemblance to rural areas in Iowa, for instance, or in key swing states, Michigan and Wisconsin, even parts of northern Ohio and Pennsylvania, I think are economically, socially, culturally similar. And yeah, it's very striking that Bernie has been able to get the message there. And it's not just that Trump voters didn't turn out against Bernie. He actually won more raw votes than Hillary Clinton won in those places. So the Democrats can win in 2020. There's only two ways to do it: bring in new voters, and we talk a lot about Bernie's strategy and bringing in new voters, but winning over some people who voted for Trump, and including especially people in places like that, in working class areas, in rural areas. And it's a great sign that he's shown strength there.
Well, and
Matt's
piece focused on comparing how Sanders performed in Vermont versus how Elizabeth Warren performs in Massachusetts. Something we dig into.
She does terribly. She's not popular.
She doesn't do well. Yeah. I mean, and if you look at the top line numbers, Sanders is one of the most popular senators in the country. He is the most popular among his own constituents. She's one of the least popular.
Yes.
She underperforms in these same rural, deindustrialized areas. And so it's very interesting to see in something that touches something that we've talked about a lot on this show, their different coalitions and why they have these very different appeals. Sanders has the populist movement approach to politics. She has the technocratic, let's get the white papers and the experts. That has a much more limited appeal among the people that we're supposed to be trying to win back.
And what's something we forget about Massachusetts all the time? That's birth of industrialism in the United States, right there in Massachusetts. Deindustrialized communities and poor working class communities are very much affected in Massachusetts. You know, Trump won like 40% of the vote in Massachusetts primary, completely blew out everybody else. It's very much because of this phenomenon. The fact that she can't connect to them and has to rely on Boston and its suburbs and those type of places in order to win, like the Cambridge candidate, that says everything about how she might be able to perform in a Midwest.
And completely also debunks this idea that she would be more electable because she doesn't say the word socialism.
Yeah,
I mean,
no,
it just
you're right.
like is completely belied by any data.
It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with how she connects with actual voters. She speaks to Cambridge, and the people in Cambridge love it, and they like it, so we should listen to them.
I mean, I was in Cambridge this week. It was a lot of fun. Anyway, Saagar, what else do we have?
All right, finally, we wanted to return to our conversation with John Nichols, as he's been covering the Iowa caucuses for The Nation. He says the Hawkeye state's interest in populist, progressive politicians doesn't end with Bernie Sanders.
I have covered presidential campaigns in Iowa going back a very long time. In fact, I dare say, and this is a horrible way to say it, I think I was covering presidential politics in Iowa before AOC was born.
Wow.
So I've seen a lot of it. And I've seen when a strong candidate hits the ground, what the response is, how people line up, how they stick around, how they want to ask questions, how they want to listen, and frankly, how they want to embrace and hug and get their picture with that candidate. AOC has all of that now as a non-candidate. I was at an event in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where people were lined up, out of the hall, out of the ballroom, hours before she got there. And I'm not saying that it's all for her. I think a lot of it is for Bernie Sanders, the candidate that she is backing. But I cannot emphasize what a powerful surrogate she has turned out to be for Bernie Sanders. It's really quite striking.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think is so interesting because both the Democratic and the Republicans have gotten AOC completely wrong.
Yeah,
right? The fact that she would draw such a crowd in Iowa when she's supposed to be, especially the caricature from like the Fox Newses of the world that she's some, just
turned into a boogeyman, which is so
and that
foolish.
She's just this like urban creature who can't possibly have appeal across the country. They're totally wrong, and they miss the fact that as a working class person herself, that is the tradition that she comes out from, which has broad appeal across the country.
Right, yeah, no, that's exactly right. Listen, I've long been so annoyed with the way that the right has tried to caricature or go after AOC. They've tried to, it's like you said, they tried to, it was like from Queens, like radical. And I'm like, well, we actually live in a pretty radical age. It's like so many people don't understand Donald Trump is a guy on The Apprentice is president and won the industrial Midwest. Like, does that sound very like rural or whatever? No, it doesn't. We need to understand the cross appeal of so many of these messages in urban and in rural areas, that the fact that everybody is actually affected in very different ways by monopolistic and corporate interests, right? Like an urban worker doesn't have to deal with big ag, but the financial threads between their lack of power in our society, it's the same thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, that does it for us today. We'll be back later today for our recurring segment with Katie Halper from Rolling Stone's Useful Idiots podcast, where we break down the week that was in media mishaps.
And tomorrow we're going to have another round of #RisingQs. We're going to see you then.